Hi, my name is Tom Charlton, and today I'm going to be talking to you about CBRNE Essentials. The objectives for today's training are hazmat scene control, chemical agents, biological agents, nuclear and radiological problems, decontamination, and terrorism. With hazmat, we worry about anything that in any quantity poses a threat or unreasonable risk to life, health, or property. And this can include chemicals, wastes, other industrial products. Sometimes it'll be in solid, liquid, or gas form. And the dangers primarily are from toxicity, meaning the biological effects on you, flammability, or its ability to catch fire, and reactivity, which is its ability to react with other things in the environment. Placards are one way that we can identify what chemicals a tanker truck is carrying, and it designates a hazardous material. The 4-digit number that's there is able to be looked up in multiple different references that we're going to talk about here shortly. And the color of the placard identifies the class of the hazardous material, whether that's flammable, radioactive, explosive, or poisonous. This is the NFPA 704 system, which is similar, however, it's for buildings and is only prevalent here in the United States. It's a 0 to 4 system, with 0 being minimal and 4 being maximal. And the various color codes there correspond with whether it's a health, fire, or reactivity issue. The white box at the bottom outlines anything special, such as if it's radioactive. There's some resources that you can use when dealing with hazardous materials, including the North American Emergency Response Guidebook, or the Orange Book. This gives first responders enough information to manage a hazardous material situation for approximately 30 minutes. There's also the newer Wiser application, which you can download onto your phone, that has even more information than the ERG. Chemtrek and Chemtel are two third-party services that many chemical manufacturers contract with that can also provide additional resources to you and answer additional questions about manifests and additional response. Your job as a firefighter or paramedic is to recognize the warning signs of a hazardous materials incident, know how to protect yourself, know whether you should be attempting rescue, which most of the time is no, or backing yourself out, how to isolate the area, how to get additional resources, and then know if you should be attempting gross decontamination of your patients. We're now going to watch a short video produced by the Phoenix Fire Department regarding a near-miss incident they had.
Fire Department, what's the location of the emergency?
It's on 24th Street in Osborne.
Okay, in the McDonald's there, ma'am?
It's inside McDonald's.
Okay.
One of our employees fell down.
Okay.
And she's pregnant.
Okay. Is she complaining of any pain anywhere?
I'm sorry?
Is she complaining of any pain?
Yeah, she's crying. She can't stand up.
Okay, I'm going to get some help on the way out there.
Okay.
Where is she having pain?
And she's pregnant.
Okay, how far along is she?
I don't know.
Do you know how many months?
4 months.
4 months? Okay. Did she hit her head or pass out at all?
I'm sorry?
Did she hit her head or pass out at all?
No, she fell down like in her bottom.
And she wasn't up on a ladder or anything? She just fell from standing?
She just slipped from on the floor.
Okay. All right, just keep her comfortable. Don't move her. They'll be there in just a few minutes to help her out, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, on May 31st at about 2100 hours, Engine 61 was dispatched to a fall injury at 3323 North 24th Street in McDonald's. We get in the truck. PTI is a 24-year-old pregnant female, tripped and fell. That's the only information we got. Roll up on scene, and we were met by the manager immediately outside. She confirmed that there was somebody who tripped and fell. When we went in, we actually were led back to the kitchen, which was still in full operation. Patrons were making their orders, burgers were getting cooked, fries were getting fried. Go back to the back of the kitchen, and there was a female at the top of the stairs laying down. The only information we continued to get from the manager was that she tripped and fell.
Try to figure out what's going on, okay? We're gonna put a blood pressure cuff on you.
Do you know her name?
Anything?
She wasn't really talking to us at all. She seemed like she was either injured or upset, crying, slightly hysterical with the way she wasn't answering any of our questions.
Nobody there was really helping us with any information. It's like nobody knew what was going on. You need to try to control your breathing. You're breathing too fast. You're going to hyperventilate. Your fingers are going to start to tingle. You're going to have cramping. So can you try to work with me here?
Is your stomach hurt?
At some point, one of the other workers told us that she fell as she was coming up the stairs. So myself and the engineer decided we'd go down and see if there was something slippery or what might have happened.
We're going to just check it out.
Does anybody know her name?
Smell anything?
I don't smell anything.
Does anybody know her name? You're gonna anybody know what happened?
We got to the bottom of the stairs, and he was ahead of me, and we were just, using our nose, trying to sniffing around, see if she slipped on something, if it was wet down there. We didn't know.
Didn't really smell anything. I didn't really smell anything, but my engineer said that he could smell something. As I was taking some deep breaths, I knew that, I felt like a little burning in my throat and a little burning in my lungs. But when we looked around, we're really in the basement for maybe 15 seconds, but there were paint cans down there were chemicals down there, supplies that they would normally keep in a basement or in a shed.
I said, something doesn't seem right. I said, let's get out of here. Something's going on. I don't feel right. I smell something really weird, and he agreed.
We decided to go ahead and head back up the stairs, and I was about halfway up when I looked up and saw my engineer fall into the wall.
As we're walking back up the stairs, right as I got to the top, I started getting lightheaded and dizzy, and right when I got to the top of the stairs, I just like collapsed and like fell, and it just kind of uncontrollable. I couldn't control myself. I just wasn't sure what was going on.
And I didn't really understand what was going on. He didn't seem like he was that disoriented while we were going up, but just as about the same distance that I was from him, as I cleared that distance, I got really lightheaded myself. The breaths that I was taking started to cause me to cough. And as soon as I got to the top of the stairs, I told my captain, I don't know what's down there, but something is down there that's not making me feel right. It's not making me, breathe right.
What's going on?
There's something down there.
Let's go. Everybody out. Everybody out. Let's go. Grab her. Let's get out of here. Out of here. Everybody out of here. Everybody out of here.
When I looked at them, I knew something was wrong. And they said that they almost passed out, and I knew they weren't joking around. So immediately called for a 3-in-1 hazardous, an additional ALS and a rescue for the patient. Luckily, there was a Phoenix police officer on scene who kind of saw us rolling hot, and it was nice having a uniformed officer there to help us evacuate the restaurant. There were still people in the drive-thru making their order, people sitting down and eating. We got the restaurant evacuated immediately. The response was on its way, and we were able to, my guys were still functional enough where we were able to stretch, hand jack a line across 24th Street, stretch a hand line, and wait for hazmat teams to roll up.
Phoenix McDonald's had to be evacuated after fumes caused a pregnant employee to pass out. This happened last night near 24th Street and Osborne. Police got the call that a pregnant employee had fainted in the stairway. Workers say she had been feeling lightheaded and dizzy, and authorities found carbon dioxide leaking from the soda machines in the basement. They say it was a dangerous situation, and it was lucky that no one was hurt. The woman is going to be okay, by the way.
Restaurants historically, and Circle K's and everything else, have historically used CO2 to carbonate their beverages, but they've always been just pressurized tanks. In the last, and I don't know when it's happened, but we're seeing it more and more often where they're starting to use liquid CO2 dewars, and because they can fill that one CO2 tank, the owner told me, once a month, where the other tanks, they were filling them every couple days. Really what had happened down there is with that liquid CO2 leaking, it filled that basement completely up. It was basically a swimming pool full of CO2. So you have a huge CO2 liquid tank below grade, and a fairly significant leak at a 3,000 to 1 expansion ratio, it pushed a significant amount of oxygen out of the air and filled the whole basement up with CO2.
We assembled an entry team in full PPE with breathing air. We also brought down our what we call our Sirius meter, which is an air monitoring meter, and also our gas ranger natural gas meters. Upon going down the stairs into the basement of the McDonald's, I immediately got an alarm on my Sirius meter indicating there was a decreased amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, which was concerning to us because, you know, obviously there's something in there that's displacing that oxygen. That means something's going on down there. So we proceeded down the stairs. At the base of the stairs, almost immediately, all the alarms started going off on all of the meters, including the natural gas meter, which was a little bit concerning to us because we really weren't expecting that. We brought that down just to be safe, but that meter was indicating almost 100% gas in the atmosphere, which kind of changed the perspective of the whole incident because it really wasn't something we were expecting. So at that point, we sort of decided that, you know, this was more than we'd bargained for. This was definitely something that was extremely hazardous, and we elected at that point to withdraw out of the space, go back outside, secure the utilities to the building, and then kind of talk about what we had found in a safe location so that we can come up with maybe a better game plan to handle this. One of the things that I did notice when we were making our entry, when these meters were going off, is I did view this CO2 tank, and I noticed that there was a device next to it that marked that it was a CO2 detector. And it indicated that it had power to it, it had a ready light, and it was also not alarming at the time. So that was one of the things that was kind of a curveball to us in this incident, is that we had every reason in the world to believe this was a CO2 leak, yet it had a detector right next to the container itself that was not indicating that there was a problem at the time. Later, I believe it was discovered that tape had been put over that detection device while they were filling it or working on it for whatever reason, and they neglected to remove the tape, rendering the detector useless. Normally, things that are that hazardous or have those types of chemicals involved are always very clearly labeled as to emergency procedures to shut down, etc. This really didn't have any of that. There was no clear markings as to how to shut the container down. So we were kind of starting from scratch in terms of the learning curve of how to secure this. We were able to locate some very small thumb valves on several of the different ports at the top of the container, which we assumed could only be valves that would shut the product off. There really wasn't a main valve, a big thing, anything painted red or something that you would discern as in emergency situations that you would secure that with. So we turned off all the valves. We didn't hear any active leaking at the time. It showed that the container, I believe, was half full, which if it was filled that day, that led us to believe that there was possibly something involved with that, where half that product may have escaped out. So we did secure all of that. We also checked the hot water heater and some of the other gas appliances down there, and they appeared to be functioning normally. At that time, when we were down in the basement, we were getting oxygen readings of 17.5%. On our Sirius meter, and normal would be 20.8, 21%, something in that area. So several percent of the ambient oxygen was being eaten up by something that was down in that basement. So we definitely had something pretty serious going on. We did secure the CO2. We also had the gas secured, so at that time the decision was made that we were going to go ahead and back out, and we were going to attempt to ventilate the space and see if that would change the atmosphere. Since we had the squad truck with us, we already carried confined space fans with us, which was a valuable tool in doing this, because with a confined space fan, you can put the bellows down into a subterranean space and vent it from the bottom. And since CO2 is heavier than air, it sinks to the bottom, and that's where all of it's going to be. And this fan device will actually suck air from the bottom and expel it out of the building. So it was actually a very effective tool that we used to get this space cleared. So we did set up a confined space fan. This particular McDonald's had the basement with an exterior stairwell that went to the outside. We simply ran the bellows down the stairs and put the confined space fan up on the top, and then cleared the area so that didn't affect anybody else when it expelled that gas outside. The two curveballs we really had in this situation were the malfunctioning CO2 detector that was right next to the tank itself. And the other curveball that we had was the fact that we had gotten a high indication of natural gas present when we were making this entry on our natural gas meter. After further research and speaking with the manufacturers of the device of the gas ranger, it was discovered that in actuality, CO2, the physical properties, the chemical properties of CO2 will mimic natural gas in that detection device and actually provide you with a false positive. So we had a false positive, an indication of large amounts of natural gas, yet in actuality there really wasn't any. And that was the first time for us to know that. I've never heard of that in the hazmat world, and I think a lot of people learned that night as well. So there were several curveballs in this incident that we kind of had to overcome, but all in all, fortunately, no one got hurt, no one died, and we learned a very good lesson. And hopefully in the future we'll be able to handle these situations with much more efficiency.
More and more restaurants and Circle K's and everything else are switching over to this liquid CO2 system because of that expansion ratio. But for us, what it means, all these things that we've found at least are all plumbed with plastic line, and the freeze and thaw, those lines have the potential to break and cause the situation we had. The significance of this incident to us is we had 2 potential civilian victims and possibly more. A lot of times in these situations, the potential rescuers end up being more of the problem than the initial person that was down. And then of course the close call for our firefighters. We had 2 firefighters go down into that basement into an oxygen deficient atmosphere and were aware enough to get out of there before they went down. So it's a pretty significant incident for us. It really opened our eyes to the fact that there are these systems all over the city, and they're all plumbed the same way. There's the potential danger at every one of them.
Carbon dioxide gas has a very long history in the world of causing death. And this, interestingly enough, can even occur in open air because carbon dioxide is heavier than air in general and can settle in low-lying areas. So even carbon dioxide, for example, coming out of the opening of mines or whatever to the surface can settle in low-lying areas so that persons walking through those areas can actually pass out and die because of elevated CO2 concentrations. The toxicity of carbon dioxide is due to 2 major factors. The first is that it's what's termed a simple asphyxiant in that it can displace air. And since air is about 20.8 or 21% oxygen, when you displace that oxygen, you're removing the oxygen that we need to breathe. So you're entering a low oxygen environment. But unlike other simple asphyxiants such as nitrogen gas or argon gas, for example, or even helium, which is a common gas used for suicide, unlike those other gases, carbon dioxide in high concentrations also can directly affect the brain to produce coma and respiratory depression. And we call this carbon dioxide narcosis or CO2 narcosis.
The big issue with it is that it's an oxygen displacer. But in high concentrations like we had there at McDonald's, they said the potential was about 25% CO2 in that air in the basement. At that high of a concentration, you tend to get a bitter taste in your mouth because the saliva in your mouth breaks that CO2 down into carbonic acid. So you will typically get some sort of a bitter taste, and we had a couple guys on scene reporting that bitter taste.
The person may start breathing rapidly, feeling as though they can't get their breath. As their brain begins to fail from lack of oxygen, they may become lightheaded, their visual fields may begin to constrict, and their heart rate will increase. They may or may not detect that. And then they will simply go to sleep and pass out from lack of oxygen and from the narcotic effect of very high concentrations of carbon dioxide as well.
You know, this incident will definitely change my approach to those scenarios forever. That basement is a confined space. There are those large CO2 tanks down there, and when I reflect back about the incident as to how we operated, we operated within our operating procedures, and I think the scariest part about this is that this could have potentially been a life-threatening incident, and it was solely based on the actions of others. And those tanks being in there, the large tanks being in there, us getting no information, very little information, having to guess, having to investigate ourselves, do all those things that we do on a normal day-to-day basis.
All of the information that I've heard about that incident, that it could have been a lot worse than it was, I guess. We go on all kinds of different calls on a regular basis and oftentimes don't give them a second thought. as long as we make it back to the station. But I guess the margin of error on this call was a lot less than what it normally is. I guess we could have very easily just taken one breath and passed out down there. You know, the two of us being down there kind of investigating, who knows how long it would have been that we'd have been laying down there before somebody else came down and the same thing happened to them. Now you got 3, 4 firefighters laying in your basement unconscious, and how long before they're discovered?
Now we're going to talk about hazmat zones. So the hot zone is considered where all the contamination is. To be in this area, you typically require special protective equipment. In the warmer control zone is where people are still wearing PPE. However, this is where decontamination is occurring. The cold or safe zone is where EMS units will be stationed for transporting any potential victims. The risk to the public is supposed to be minimal at this point once you've reached that zone, as all the contamination should be contained deeper within. When we talk about decontaminating people, it should be performed on anyone that's been contaminated by a hazardous material. And how we go about decontaminating them is going to depend on the type of material. For example, if what we're dealing with is primarily gaseous, simply moving the patient out of the gaseous environment and into fresh air may be all the decontamination that's needed. If it's a powder, typically brushing it off and then rinsing the skin is enough. We want to make sure that we decon the patient before moving them into the cold zone. If it's done in the warm zone, then we've got all the personal protective equipment to protect the people that are actually doing the decon. When you don't know what to do as far as decontamination, the solution is dilution, meaning get them wet. There are a few different ways that we can go about decontaminating patients on a gross scale. A very simple way is by using a fire engine with fire hoses at fairly low pressure and fog and having patients essentially walk through them, or setting up a tower with a similar approach. This is a picture from me when I was in Anniston, Alabama at the FEMA Chemical Warfare School. And I always thought it was funny because of the I'm naked t-shirts that we had to strip the actors down to. Let's talk briefly about chlorine. It's a very commonly encountered chemical, and pretty much every household in the United States is going to have some sort of bleach, which is sodium hypochlorite. Household bleach with the right mixtures of other chemicals can form chlorine gas. However, chlorine gas is also used both as a chemical warfare agent or in various industrial products. There's also hydrochloric acid, which is very common as well in industrial applications that will sometimes get released. As you can see in this video, it forms this greenish yellow cloud in its warfare appearance. The PPE that you're required to have when dealing with chlorine depends on the chemical. Some of the time this may only require splash protection, such as you're dealing with household bleach. Others is going to require level B or even level A protection. In general, you need some sort of splash protection with a special chlorine respiratory filter. The reality is, most of the time, this is going to be something where we're on an SCBA and not relying on a respiratory filter, though. Patients that are exposed to chlorine typically are irritant-like symptoms. Cough, shortness of breath, burning with respiration. All of this can cause pulmonary edema, laryngospasm, and then respiratory arrest. There's also going to be significant nasal and eye irritation, so expect people to be tearing as well as having significant runny nose. If you ingest chlorine-related products, it typically causes GI upset. Industrial scale bleach can also cause GI perforation. However, household bleach in small quantities typically does not. When treating someone with chlorine exposure, you want to make sure you remove them from the environment, provide them with supplemental oxygen and respiratory support. Nebulized bronchodilators may help improve some of the symptoms, both by relieving the bronchospasm as well as by the humidity helping to dilute down some of the chlorine that has been absorbed by the mucous membrane. Nebulized lidocaine I personally have used on patients before, which also can help with the burning sensation and the coughing. I've not personally done it, but sodium bicarb has also been recommended in literature and is sometimes beneficial as a nebulizer. Any skin contamination should be irrigated and provided basic wound care. Ocular exposures are going to require continuous irrigation until the pH is 7, and then providing basic burn care thereafter. We're going to pivot now and talk a little bit more about explosions. So when we're dealing with explosives, it spreads a shock wave out in all directions. And the way to think of a shock wave is extremely, extremely compressed air. We're going to show a video here shortly of a blast that was accidental that you can actually see the shock wave refracting the light differently because it's been compressed so much compared to the surrounding air. This shock wave rapidly diminishes over distance, and barriers provide some protection. For example, standing behind a wall is going to provide you significantly more protection than if the blast wave hit you directly. However, unfortunately, the effects are greatly amplified in small spaces, such as bunkers and subway stations. In this case, instead of the blast wave being able to rapidly dissipate over distance, it simply gets reflected by the walls and ceiling back into the cavity of the room. Places that have windows and doors, etc., those windows and doors may blow outward, providing a pressure relief from the overpressurization of the blast.
We were unable to fuse metal with our head-on collisions, but apparently there is a process by which one can bond metals using an impact, and it's called explosive welding. Unlike the testing we were doing earlier, which is pretty much chaos, explosive welding is a precision process. We're going to take this plate, put it on top of the other at a specific distance, apply explosives in a very precise way, and that'll get the job done.
So essentially, they'll be using 500 pounds of high explosive to literally push the steel plates into each other. And safely hunkered in the bunker, it's time to weld by numbers. And those numbers are
3, 2, 1.
Wow! That was a thud. It was bigger than I expected from, that innocuous box of white powder that we set up down there.
From that innocuous box of white powder to one of the coolest shots we've ever seen on Mythbusters.
There's the shockwave. I never get tired of seeing that. Look, look, look. You can even see the shadow of the shockwave there on the ground.
Looks like there's a lot of stuff that's kind of spraying out all around the ground at the same time as it's shooting up. It's going to be like a potato chip, I think.
You were right. It is a little potato chippy.
I couldn't very well imagine it stays straight like it was to start.
Oh, yeah. If you take a look at the side here, it's quite clear that the total thickness is less than the combined thickness of the two sheets when we started.
Yeah, it looks like it's like clay.
Just to give you an idea about how much force was involved in that explosion, I'm standing at ground zero of where that explosion occurred. It's about a 3-foot deep crater, and interesting note, this is very similar to the crater that Jamie created when he first came to Earth.
Well, that there was one heck of a lot of destruction and mayhem we created in pursuit of this myth.
I'll say.
Well, where does that leave us?
Well, we've proved that it is possible to pancake a compact car.
Although you'd have to go close to the speed of sound to do it.
And we've proven that you can fuse two pieces of steel together.
You need about 500 pounds of high explosive to do that.
And since none of those things happen on any highway or freeway I've ever driven on, I think we have to call this one...
Busted.
Yeah, busted. Again, busted.
When we talk about injury patterns from explosions, we really break them out into what we now consider 4 types of injuries. It's not important that you know what types of injuries to expect, but more the concept of there are different layers of injuries that can occur. A primary blast injury is an injury because of the blast of the explosion itself. So this is the overpressurization that occurs with the blast wave hitting you. So this would include rupturing your lung, causing a pneumothorax, blowing out your tympanic membranes, etc. Secondary injuries are any injuries that are sustained by any flying debris, such as shrapnel, any of the gases, and any of the burns and heat that may be accompanying the blast. A tertiary injury is when you're being thrown by the explosion. So the shock wave has picked you up now and thrown you against a brick wall, and you've become injured from that. There's now a quaternary category even where, unfortunately, there have been instances of suicide bombers that were infected with typically HIV or one of the hepatitises, exploding themselves with the hope that by blowing themselves up, any of the shrapnel of that bomb will now become infected with the HIV or hepatitis and infect other people, spreading even further damage. Most damage to patients occurs from standing and facing the explosion. If you know the detonation is getting ready to occur, it's obviously best to be lying prone, meaning face down, away from the injury. And ideally behind some sort of sturdy barrier that's going to provide even more protection to you. By laying down flat, you're now exposing significantly less surface area to that blast wave as compared to if you were facing it full on. The injuries that we're going to see from blast injuries is typically going to involve lungs, abdominal organs, if they're close enough from the blast wave or from any resulting trauma, such as getting thrown into a building or having a building collapse on them. Eardrums and ossicles may rupture or be dislocated. This frequently means that lots of patients immediately following these will have either temporary or permanent hearing loss. Crush injuries are likely, especially if there's been any associated building collapse. And shrapnel can be thrown just like bullets, except sometimes significantly larger. Burns can be significant. However, in general, when we're dealing with these types of mass casualty incidents, we need to treat the trauma before we treat the burn. The patient is far more likely to bleed out from their liver laceration than they are from their or to die from their massive burns. We're now going to pivot to chemicals. So when we talk about chemical warfare agents, it can be pretty much any agent, including household chemicals. Some of these can be weaponized, but that's less likely. There are a couple of things that we need to remind you about, though, of chemical properties. One is volatility, which is the chemical's ability to off-gas or to evaporate. And the other is persistence, which refers to the ability to remain a liquid. And a great example of this that most firefighters can relate to is gasoline versus diesel. Gasoline is extremely volatile. It's able to off-gas and evaporate very rapidly, and as a result, we can typically set it on fire. Whereas diesel has very significant persistence. We can't set it on fire as easily and wants to stay a liquid. We have, unfortunately, some chem warfare agents that are called nerve agents. These were originally developed back in the 1920s and 30s as pesticides that have subsequently become weaponized. A couple of the trade names that you'll hear are sarin, VX, Taboon, among others. There's also a relatively new comer to the block that only the Russians currently know how to make, which is called Novichok. They all typically cause sludge symptoms, meaning salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, gastric distress, and emesis. Essentially, if your body has an ability to get something wet, this has turned them all on. And so the patient is going to be perspiring like crazy, vomiting, foaming at the mouth, tearing like crazy, and has typically urinated on themselves. This also is associated with tachypnea, tachycardia, dim eyesight, apnea, and hypotension. These patients will also typically seize, and then as things run its course, This eventually overwhelms the nervous system to the point where you are now paralyzed and can no longer breathe on your own.
What would happen if terrorists got their hands on a weapon of mass destruction? This is one of the most terrifying scenarios that people can imagine. But it isn't an idle fear. It actually happened in 1995. I'm Jim Lindsay, and this is Lessons Learned. Our topic today is the sarin gas attack that the Japanese cult Aum Shinrikyo launched in the Tokyo subway system on March 20th, 1995. Aum Shinrikyo, which translates as Supreme Truth, was a religious cult started in 1984 by Shoko Asahara. He had lost most of his sight as a child, and as a young adult he studied various strains of Taoism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. These studies eventually convinced him of two things: that he was the first enlightened one to appear on earth since Buddha, and that the end of the world was near. Asahara targeted his pitch at disillusioned young people. He was a good recruiter. By 1995, Aum Shinrikyo had as many as 40,000 followers. Just as important, Aum Shinrikyo grew rich. By the early 1990s, it had more than $300 million in assets. How did the cult get so wealthy? Partly by running businesses, and partly by requiring members to sign their wealth over to the cult. Aum Shinrikyo's deep pockets enabled it to secretly master the difficult task of making sarin. First created in the 1930s by Nazi scientists looking for better pesticides, sarin is a deadly nerve agent. It kills by disrupting the ability of nerves to communicate with the rest of the body. Sarin is so toxic that inhaling a single drop can be lethal. During the rush hour on the morning of March 20th, 1995, 5 Aum Shinrikyo agents put a liquid form of sarin into packages made to look like lunch boxes and bottled drinks. Perhaps they were driven by the belief that the apocalypse was beginning. Or perhaps they wanted to punish Japan because police were about to raid Aum Shinrikyo's offices. Whatever their motives, the Aum Shinrikyo agents boarded 3 subway lines, punctured their packages with umbrellas, and walked away. The liquid sarin leaked out and turned into gas. The results were horrific. Within minutes, commuters lay on the ground gasping for air, blood pouring from their noses and mouths. Said one survivor of the attacks, "Hell describes it perfectly." 12 people died that day. 4,000 to 6,000 more were injured. The death toll would have been many times higher had Aum Shinrikyo succeeded in creating a more effective way to disperse the deadly sarin gas. Japanese officials discovered after the attack that Aum Shinrikyo had been experimenting for years with chemical and biological weapons. Indeed, the cult had carried out at least 9 biological attacks. They had all failed because the cult hadn't found an effective way to spread the biological agents. And Aum Shinrikyo had used sarin gas at least once before, in a previously unexplained incident that killed 7 people in a Tokyo neighborhood. Asahara and his accomplices were charged with murder. In 2004, they were sentenced to death by hanging. Asahara exhausted his legal appeals in 2006. He now awaits execution. What is the lesson of Aum Shinrikyo's sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway system? Just this: technology makes it possible for groups and individuals to carry out the kinds of attacks that once only governments could undertake. If anything, advances in technology are making it easier for terrorists to contemplate using weapons of mass destruction. The internet makes it far easier to find and share information. Cheaper, more powerful computers and better scientific instruments make it possible for people with basic skills to accomplish things that once required sophisticated laboratories and teams of highly trained, highly skilled scientists. These concerns lie at the heart of the current dispute over news that scientists have discovered a way to transform the H5N1 bird flu virus into a form that could cause a deadly human pandemic. Many scientists worry that this work could eventually be duplicated by less skilled individuals intent on doing harm. Such debates are only going to grow more and more heated in the years to come as technological advances make it possible to do more and more with less and less training. So here is a question to consider. What steps should society take to protect itself as technological developments make it easier for terrorists, messianic figures, or just embittered individuals to inflict great harm? I encourage you to weigh in with your answers on my blog, The Water's Edge. You can find it at CFR.org. cbrsne.org. I'm Jim Lindsay. Thank you for watching this installment of Lessons Learned.
When we're treating a nerve agent exposure, we're typically going to be using this medication called Duodote, which is a pre-filled auto-injector filled with atropine along with pralidoxime or 2-PAM, which is the antidote. The priorities are to protect yourself, focus initially on the patient's airway and ventilation, administer the antidote kit, which is for us typically going to be a Duodote, be prepared for seizures, and then cover the patient to prevent further exposure to others, such as simply with a blanket or a mylar space blanket. Chempacks are federal assets that are designed to rapidly deploy to the scene of a mass casualty chemical warfare attack. You would call central dispatch to coordinate the activation. The goal is to deploy these assets within 15 minutes of them being activated. However, the reality is, as one of these has never been actually requested, it typically would take longer than that, as there are, I'm sure, going to be many questions about why a Chempack is needed. Depending on distance, it's either deployed by Ohio State Patrol ground units or by helicopter. The Chempacks are typically designed to treat nerve agent exposures for 50 or more casualties. EMS Chempack has a 554 casualty capacity per pack. And it includes Mark I auto-injectors, atropine auto-injectors and multi-dose vials, 2-PAM pralidoxime multi-dose vials, diazepam auto-injectors for the seizures, as well as single-dose vials, along with sterile water. The hospital Chempacks are significantly larger, from 1,000 or more casualties. Vesicants are an older type of chemical warfare agent that typically anymore we only hear about over in Europe. They were used extensively throughout World War I. They usually have a thick, oily, sometimes volatile liquid, and sometimes they have delayed symptoms. Unfortunately, farmers in Belgium and France and Germany will occasionally be tilling their fields and come across an unexploded one of these that requires an explosive ordnance team to disable it. Exposure to these agents typically causes burning, redness, necrosis, and blistering of the skin. Can also cause stinging, tearing, and ulceration of the eyes, shortness of breath, coughing, wheezing, and pulmonary edema if it's inhaled. Nausea and vomiting is fairly common, along with significant fatigue. Mustard gas has an odor of onions, garlic, or mustard. Phosgene smells like newly mown grass or hay, and unfortunately is also produced in most house fires. You treat these by continuously irrigating the affected areas, and you treat the burns as chemical burns. Irrigate the eyes until arrival at the emergency department if possible. This is an example from World War I of a soldier who failed to get their gas mask on fast enough. And this is the outcomes of a chemical warfare attack. With this, you can see that the soldier was likely wearing a short sleeve shirt. As you can see, it looks like his forearms have become blistered. He has some evidence of the liquid having penetrated through his shirt and run down into his armpit areas, hence the burning there, and then his entire face is exposed. Cyanide is another gaseous or solid chemical warfare agent, and what it does is it causes your body to not be able to use oxygen. The pulse oximeter will likely be normal, and unfortunately cyanide is produced in most house fires. Typically what happens is the patient will act very much like a hypoxic patient, however they will have a normal pulse ox. They'll have anxiety, weakness, dizziness, nausea, tachycardia, apnea, and then unresponsiveness. The cyanokit, however, is a rapid reversal agent. You can use the cyanokit to reverse the effects, provide high flow oxygen, manage the airway and breathing, and remember that treatment is time sensitive. Around here, there are several caches of the cyanokits available with various fire departments. However, pretty much every hospital is going to have several treatment vials available, and so it may be faster to simply get them to the hospital. The treatment is time sensitive, so if these show up on your scene, you are authorized to use them. And this is what the contents of the cyano kit look like. Choking agents are another World War I agent. They're usually a gas that cause tearing, runny nose, throat irritation, dyspnea, wheezing, cough, crackles, stridor, and excessive secretions. Phosgene, which we already mentioned, again produced in house fires. Chlorine gas is considered one of these. And we can also see similar types of agents in chemical plants and in pools. Our focus should be on managing the airway, providing high flow oxygen, suctioning secretions, and then administering albuterol for any wheezing. Now we're going to pivot into biological warfare. With biological warfare, essentially what we've done is we've taken any run-of-the-mill disease and begun intentionally infecting people with it. This has been used for centuries as an effective weapon. Back in the Dark Ages, it was known that we would unfortunately launch dead bodies infected with the plague over city walls in order to spread the plague throughout those cities, making taking them over far easier. Smallpox has been used here in North America when European settlers unfortunately would give smallpox infested blankets to Native American populations, which decimated those populations. Today, however, we can use these same types of agents and weaponize them. That's usually delivered via a spray, as we saw following 9/11, the mail, or by person-to-person spread. Biological warfare agents are not likely to be detected by EMS, and frankly, the emergency department either, as they all have incubation periods. We separate them out into a couple of different categories. Pneumonia-like is one of the more common ones, and it's going to look very much like pneumonia, causing cough, shortness of breath, fatigue or malaise, and fever. Plague, tularemia, and anthrax are all pneumonia-like agents. Encephalitis-like agents are another one. Smallpox is one that we still have to worry about, as it's been eradicated from nature, however, is still present in at least 2 known places in the world. The CDC's labs in Atlanta, along with a biological testing place in Russia. Encephalitis-like agents will cause headache, fever, and malaise. And in the case of smallpox, is going to have a rash. One of the differentiating factors with smallpox as compared to the other poxes, such as chickenpox, are that all of the wounds are in the same stage. As you can see here, they're all blisters and there's no scaling yet. Sometimes actors will use biologic toxins. And this is where we're not necessarily using the bacteria itself, but we're using the byproducts of that bacteria. So these are the toxic compounds or poisons derived from these organisms. These cannot be passed person to person. However, it's relatively easy to make and easy to spread. Botulism has been one of the more common ones that causes descending paralysis, diplopia, meaning double vision, apnea, and eventually death. There have been several cases where people have attempted to infect salad bars with this. Ricin has also been used around the country by several jilted lovers trying to get after either the person that they were in love with or their new partner. And this is one that's produced through castor bean oil production. And it causes weakness, fever, cough, hypothermia, abdominal pain, and eventually death. This one, unfortunately, there is no cure for, and was solely supportive care. Staphylococcus toxin is one that most of us have likely already encountered if we've been to enough church potlucks. This typically causes fever, chills, body ache, headache, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and eventually death if in high enough concentrations. With most biologic agents, it's important to protect yourself, the public, and then the patient. Most of these patients are not contagious, but some of them are, such as with smallpox. It's important to always wear your approved PPE, which in the post-COVID-19 world, we're well equipped to handle. Focus on maintaining the airway and administering oxygen. And then, of course, if they're showing signs of sepsis or septic shock, to treat that appropriately. Lastly, we're going to deal with radiation. So there's a concept that's important to understand when dealing with radiation. There's exposure, which is without anything touching you, or contamination, when it gets in or on you. So an example would be you have a pot of coffee sitting out in the break room. By walking into the room, you now smell the coffee, etc. You've been exposed to that coffee. However, if you leave that room, your exposure stops. You're no longer exposed to that coffee. However, if you walk in, have a cup of coffee, you've now contaminated yourself with that cup of coffee because now you have it within you. And when you walk out of that room, you continue to be contaminated by it. When dealing with radiation, time and distance are your friends. Minimize the time exposed or the time contaminated, and distance yourself from the source. The interesting thing about radiation is that by doubling the distance away from you, you've actually reduced your exposure by a factor of 4. Your threats are going to be from primary exposure or from fallout, which is the byproducts of any type of nuclear explosion or reaction. There are a few different types of radiation that you need to be aware of. However, again, it's not important that you remember the specifics. X-ray or gamma radiation is the most penetrating, traveling long distances, and is extremely damaging to our DNA, especially to cells that are in the process of dividing. Neutron radiation is extremely powerful and very damaging and passes straight through the human body. This, however, essentially only occurs with nuclear devices. Beta and alpha, however, are produced in the environment on a regular basis. This is low speed, low energy, and typically can be blocked by clothing or even by skin. However, these are also products of fallout, and so the main threat comes to us from ingestion or inhalation. If these products get inside of us, they provide significant internal contamination and increase our risk of cancer. When we're dealing with radiation, we need to focus on immediate life threats. Radiation that is survivable does not typically kill quickly. Remove the patient from the radiation and decon as quickly as possible. Notify the hospital early about possible radiation exposure or contamination. The reason for this is most hospitals have a nuclear physicist who is on call for them, who can help them with any kind of response that's required to a radiological emergency, such as when we accidentally spill some of our contrast agent that we use for nuclear medicine testing. Injury types that we're going to see from radioactive emergencies are going to be based on their method, whether it's an accident, meaning something that's happened in a nuclear reaction, or as I alluded to earlier, we've spilled some of the contrast agent used for nuclear medicine testing, or is this an explosion, such as a nuclear weapon or a dirty bomb? With dirty bomb explosions, this spreads radioactive material across an area and is not likely to be detected necessarily immediately because we'll be focused primarily on the explosion. Again, dirty bombs typically are more of a psychological warfare agent than the radiation truly posing a significant threat. There's a few different types of radiation illnesses that we will encounter. Radiation sickness is when you've been exposed to a large amount of radiation. And by this I mean the people that walked into the reactor room at Chernobyl or Fukushima. These patients within hours or days will have developed nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, bleeding, weight loss, malaise, fever, sores in the throat and mouth. This type of radiation sickness lowers the patient's resistance to infection because it has effectively eradicated their immune system's cells. Radiation injury, on the other hand, is a fairly localized injury, which causes hair loss, burns, and skin lesions. We typically will see this after somebody has inappropriately handled a radioactive source, such as used for X-rays of commercial welds in buildings, etc. Radiation poisoning occurs when there's large amounts of internal radiation, and this typically will cause cancer and anemia. This gentleman here is an example of radiation poisoning. He was a former KGB agent who, after the Cold War, had moved to London and unfortunately was paid a visit by several of his former colleagues who subsequently successfully assassinated him with polonium in his tea. The last thing we're going to talk about is nuclear warfare. So nuclear weapons are less likely to be used today than after the Cold War. However, we currently have some heated rhetoric coming from Russia with Ukraine. It's extremely hard to get the products to make a nuclear weapon, even though the design itself is fairly straightforward. With these types of weapons, there are going to be major injuries, blast, thermal, radioactive. The thermal burns lead to the most deaths, either from the initial flash or from the subsequent fires that will typically spread immediately following the ground zero area. The flame burns can be extensive and extend far out beyond the initial damage to buildings. The blast injuries can follow that blast wave and the inflow of the atmosphere immediately following that may subsequently collapse structures. When dealing with nuclear weapons, at this point, it would be a federal incident, and so you're going to be getting additional support from federal agencies and better direction on where and how to respond. If you really want to have a morbid afternoon, you can go to the website there, nuclearwarmap.com, and actually see what would happen as far as injury patterns, fallout patterns, etc., with various nuclear devices and their unclassified information. It's a rather frightening website to go on when you get down to think about it. Hopefully this has provided a decent overview for you of the type of chemical, biological, radioactive, and nuclear emergencies that you may encounter. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thanks.